Xavier Cole only wanted to finish tuning the piano and get his daughter home before her fever worsened. But inside the Kingsley estate, he was treated like a man who had wandered through the wrong door-worn shirt, scuffed shoes, a child clinging to his hand. Charlotte coldly asked him to leave, and the security guard was already moving toward them. Then the antique piano began playing on its own, a melody his late wife had written only for their small daughter. Xavier went still. Charlotte went pale, because that song had vanished alongside a buried family secret. Stay until the end, because that melody will restore Xavier's dignity and uncover the name that was erased. The Kingsley estate sat at the edge of Whitmore Hill like a sentence that refused to end. On an evening in early November, a thin rain fell over its stone walls and manicured hedges, soft enough to blur the carriage lights, but not quiet enough to subdue the noise inside. Through the tall, arched windows, warm chandelier light spilled across the lawn in long rectangles, and the silhouettes of guests in evening wear moved like figures in a slow, expensive dream. Tonight was the annual Kingsley Music Foundation Gala, 22 years running, gathering the city's wealthiest patrons to raise scholarship money for young artists. The kind of evening where no glass stayed empty, and every conversation carried the low hum of people reminding each other of their importance. The main hall had been arranged with precision, white orchids on every surface, a string quartet in the far corner playing Debussy that no one was quite listening to, and at the center of it all, positioned beneath a warm spotlight, as though it were the guest of honor, the Kingsley family's antique concert grand. A Bosendorfer Imperial, nearly a century old, its lacquered surface catching light like still water. The piano had stood in this hall since Samuel Kingsley's father purchased it in the 1950s. It had been played at every gala, every gathering, every memorial. It was less a musical instrument than a monument. Xavier Cole arrived at the service entrance at 7:43. He came through the side passage the way he always did, quietly, without announcement, carrying his worn leather toolkit in one hand and holding his daughter's small hand in the other. Grace was 6 years old, wrapped in a green wool coat a size too large. Her hair in 2 uneven braids Xavier had done himself that morning. She pressed a faded stuffed rabbit against her chest as she walked. The rabbit had one missing button eye and a small stitched tear near the left ear. Hannah had bought it the week before Grace was born. He had not planned to bring Grace. The sitter canceled at 4 in the afternoon, and Xavier had no one else to call on short notice. The estate's events coordinator had reached out that morning in near panic. The Bosendorfer's action had developed an irregular touch in the upper register, and the foundation had a pianist performing in 2 hours. Xavier was the best technician within 30 miles. He needed the work. So he packed his toolkit, helped Grace into her coat, and made her a quiet promise. He would work fast, and they would be home before her bedtime. He settled Grace on a bench just inside the service corridor with a cup of water and her rabbit, and told her not to move. She looked up at him and asked whether the piano was as big as the one Mama used to play. He paused, the question settling into his chest like something heavier than it should have been. He said every piano was different, but every piano had its own memory if you knew how to listen. Grace accepted this. She sat down and watched him walk away. He found the Bosendorfer quickly, set his toolkit beside the bench, and lifted the lid. The problem was real. 3 consecutive damper felts, lifting a fraction too slowly, and a resistance in the sustain pedal that would blunt dynamics in performance. Fixable in 20 minutes, he began. While working, his hand brushed the inner edge of the key bed, and he found something unexpected, a narrow housing beneath the panel, concealed behind the original manufacturer's woodwork. He recognized it immediately, the housing of a pneumatic player mechanism, the kind installed in estate pianos in the early 20th century, so they could play from a perforated paper roll. Most had been removed long ago. This one had been sealed. The intake valve was closed, the roll housing latched with a brass catch. Through a thin gap, the pale edge of a paper roll was just visible. Xavier did not touch it. He returned to the damper felts. In his shirt pocket, folded into a small rectangle, was a piece of manuscript paper covered in Hannah's handwriting. He touched it once through the fabric, without thinking the way a man touches something he has stopped trying to explain. Hannah Cole had never played Carnegie Hall. She was not famous by any measure the world kept track of, but she was extraordinary in the way certain people are extraordinary, in private. A gift that existed fully in small rooms, between people who love each other, without needing a stage to make it real. Xavier had understood this from the beginning. He had met her at a church benefit recital, where she performed 2 of her own compositions. She walked onto the stage with the focused calm of someone who had already made peace with what she was about to do, placed her hands on the keys, and played something that made him hold his breath for 4 full minutes. He had found a way to speak to her afterward. They were married 2 years later. Hannah composed at the keyboard the way other people think continuously, almost unconsciously, working through problems that don't have names yet. She wrote dozens of pieces in the years of their marriage, most of them unfinished, most of them beautiful. But the one she was most serious about, the one she notated by hand on manuscript paper and kept in a dedicated folder, was a piece she called When the Rain Comes Home. She had written it on the night Grace was born. It had rained without stopping from the moment Hannah's labor began, a steady November rain that drummed against the hospital windows. In the quiet hours before dawn, she had written down the outline of a melody in a notebook Xavier had brought from her bag, and finished it at the piano. 6 weeks later, she played it for Grace every night, not from the sheet music, from memory, sometimes with her eyes closed. Grace's breathing would slow when it began, and she would lean her head against whatever was nearest. After Hannah died, Xavier had sat at the piano once and tried to play it from memory. He got through 2 phrases before he had to stop. He had not tried again. What Hannah had told him, in one of their quieter conversations near the end, was that her education had been funded in part by an anonymous scholarship through a small legal firm. A man named Prescott had called her at 17 and told her the funds were available for conservatory enrollment. She had asked twice who the donor was, and been told both times that the benefactor preferred to remain unnamed. She had graduated with honors and spent years afterward wondering about the hand behind the gift. She found no trail. The firm had dissolved. Before she died, Hannah gave Xavier a sealed envelope. On the front, in her neat script, "If you ever come across the name Kingsley, don't walk past it." Xavier had carried it for 3 years without opening it. He was not entirely sure he understood the instruction, and there was something in him that feared what understanding it might cost. He had slipped it into his jacket pocket that evening, the same way he had slipped in the manuscript paper, not because he thought he would need it, but because some things need to be carried until they are ready to be put down. He had not made the connection until he was already in the car, 20 minutes from home, and Grace had asked where they were going. He had said the name aloud. He had felt something shift quietly in his chest. He had kept driving. Margaret Hale had managed the Kingsley household for 19 years. She was a small, precise woman in her early 60s who wore charcoal gray almost exclusively and communicated displeasure through compression rather than volume, a tightening around the eyes, a flattening of the voice, a pause held half a beat too long. She had not kept this position for 19 years by overlooking things. She found Grace at 7:51, sitting exactly where Xavier had placed her, rabbit in her lap, watching the kitchen staff move at the end of the corridor. Margaret followed the hallway toward the sound of tools until she found Xavier and told him, pleasantly but without warmth, that the service areas were restricted during event hours, and the children were not permitted in any part of the estate tonight without prior authorization. Xavier kept working and explained who he was and why he was there. Margaret said she understood, but the restrictions stood. She suggested the unlocked staff room near the maintenance area. The words were delivered without malice. That was what made them difficult to argue against. Grace heard the exchange and said nothing. She tucked the rabbit under her arm and looked at the floor. Xavier set down his regulating tool, went to her, and crouched to straighten her collar. Grace asked quietly if she had done something wrong. He said no, absolutely not, and that some rooms have rules, and the rules are not about her. Charlotte Kingsley appeared in the doorway of the main hall at 7:54, moving with the particular speed of someone who has received information they did not want. She was 31, in a deep navy gown, her dark hair arranged with studied restraint. Dr. Ellison, the Foundation's featured pianist, we had just told her that several keys in the upper register were responding inconsistently, and that he was not comfortable performing on an instrument he had not personally approved. Charlotte had a room full of donors and a presentation beginning in 90 minutes. She saw Xavier and read him through the categories her life had trained her to use. Worn collar, frayed cuff, shoes that had been resoled once and were approaching a second time, a toolkit held together in one corner with electrical tape. She saw Grace and registered the child as a complication. She asked Margaret, in a low voice, why the delivery personnel were in the front hall. Xavier introduced himself with his full name and his occupation, simply, without apology. Charlotte said she didn't recall approving a technician appointment for this evening. Xavier said her coordinator had called him that morning. Charlotte said she would confirm that later, and that in the meantime the main hall was not suitable for a child. She said the words with a flat precision that was worse than sharpness, the tone of someone who has not considered that the words might land. Xavier sent Grace to the staff room and returned to the Bosendorfer. He completed the final regulation adjustment and tested the key. Correct. He turned to the sustain pedal housing and adjusted the felt stop, and in doing so, inadvertently shifted the brass catch on the player mechanism by a fraction. He didn't notice. He was listening to the pedal response. When he straightened up, he heard Charlotte at the far end of the hall say her father's name, Samuel, in a tone that held equal parts impatience and something older, something not quite managed. Xavier touched the envelope in his jacket pocket once and said nothing. At 8:17, Grace came back. She had not meant to disobey. The staff room had been close and dim, and the sounds from the hall voices, music, the bright percussion of fine glassware filtered through the walls until she couldn't sit still. She slipped out and followed the sound she recognized, the piano. She stood in the doorway for a moment, looking for her father, then drifted inside when she couldn't locate him quickly, stopping near the Bosendorfer with one hand extended toward the keys. Not touching, just close. She was entirely out of place and entirely still. Charlotte saw her from across the room and began moving immediately, not with cruelty, but with the alarm of someone watching their carefully maintained image develop a crack. Xavier saw Charlotte at the same moment and arrived at Grace's side a step ahead of her. Charlotte stopped in front of them. Several guests had turned to look. She spoke quietly. She said she had made the expectations for this evening clear and had tried to accommodate his situation as reasonably as possible. She used the word disruption with the precision of someone who relies on clinical language to keep emotional heat out of her voice. She nodded once to Ryan Ward, who stood near the east entrance with his hands folded. Ryan was not a cruel man. He was methodical. He walked toward them without hurry. Grace looked up at her father and asked very quietly whether she had made him lose his job. Xavier crouched down and straightened one of her braids. He told her she hadn't done anything wrong, that sometimes people need things to go in a certain order and they get frightened when things don't, and that was not about her. He said it was time to go home and they would stop for hot chocolate on the way. Grace said okay in the voice children use when they are trying to be brave. A man in a charcoal suit said, without lowering his voice, that security should have caught this at the door. A woman beside him said something about the invitation list and laughed once. Xavier stood. He retrieved his toolkit without hurrying. He had been in rooms before where the furniture cost more than his monthly rent, and he had learned that the dignified response was steadiness. He steadied himself and walked toward the rear exit with Grace beside him. Ryan held the door. Xavier stopped once to collect the small regulation wrench he had left on the edge of the piano bench. As he reached for it, Grace looked at the keyboard and said something that made the air change. She said, "Daddy, this piano sounds sad, like Mama's song." Xavier went very still. Behind him, the stage technician had just reconnected the power strip for the audio monitoring system. The Bosendorfer's pneumatic mechanism ran on the same circuit. When power returned, the intake valve, fractionally unsealed by Xavier's earlier adjustment to the pedal housing, caught a pressure differential and began to draw. The ancient bellows, dry with disuse but structurally intact, shuddered once and found their rhythm. The paper roll began to move. Keys descended one by one, slowly at first as the mechanism worked through decades of stiffness, then settling into tempo. The melody emerged not from the concert program, not from any performer's hands, not from anything Charlotte had planned. It came from inside the piano itself, from a roll of perforated paper that had been locked away for years. When the rain comes home, Xavier could not move. Grace stepped forward and watched the keys descend with an expression that held recognition and grief, and something that only children have a name for, and rarely say aloud. She said, "That's Mama." The string quartet had stopped. The room went quiet in the way a room does when everyone feels something simultaneously and none of them know what it is yet. Charlotte stood with one hand, slightly raised the signal she had given Ryan, and her face had lost its composure in exactly the way a face loses. Composure when it recognizes something it was not prepared to recognize. She had heard this melody before, once, through the closed door of her father's study, playing from a cassette tape on a machine she had not been allowed to touch. She had been 9 years old and had asked what song it was. Samuel had looked at her for a long moment and said it was something private. He had locked the door after that. Ryan lowered his hand. Charlotte gave him no new instruction. For the first time since Xavier Cole had arrived through the service entrance, Charlotte Kingsley looked at him not as a problem to be managed, but as a question she was desperate to answer. The piano played on. The mechanism was old, and the tempo shifted slightly in the middle section, but none of that diminished what it was. The melody was unhurried, built on a simple descending figure that resolved into something that felt against all reason. For people who had never heard it before, like arriving somewhere they had not expected to recognize. Guests who had drifted toward the adjacent rooms came back. They stood at the edges of the hall and watched the keys move without anyone touching them, listening to a piece none of them could name. Xavier walked to the piano, not quickly pulled rather than walking, the slow movement of a man drawn by something he cannot name. He stood beside the open lid and watched the hammers rise and fall. The mechanism carried the melody without the full dynamics, but Xavier recognized every note. He could have sung every phrase. Grace stood beside him and hummed along, barely audibly, the way she did when she was trying to remember something she already knew. The sound was small enough that only Xavier could hear it. His eyes went hot. Charlotte approached and asked carefully whether he knew this piece. Xavier said it belonged to his wife. He said her name was Hannah Cole. He said she had written it the night their daughter was born. At the name Hannah, Margaret Hale went white, not the pale of surprise, the pale of someone whose carefully maintained equilibrium has just received a precise and targeted strike. Charlotte saw Margaret's reaction and filed it. She asked Xavier to show her whatever documentation he had. He took the folded manuscript paper from his shirt pocket and opened it, old ivory paper, Hannah's small, neat handwriting, the title centered at the top. When the rain comes home, for Grace, always. Every phrase currently sounding in the hall was written on that page, in the hand of a woman who had been dead for 3 years. Charlotte looked at the manuscript. She looked at the piano. She asked Margaret to please take the guests to the reception room. Margaret began to say something. Charlotte looked at her, and Margaret stopped. From the upper landing of the main staircase came the slow, deliberate tap of a walking cane on marble. Samuel Kingsley appeared at the top of the stairs, supported by his night nurse, moving with the careful economy of a man whose body had become unreliable, but whose mind had not. He wore a dark cardigan over his pajamas. He had clearly not planned to come downstairs tonight. He stopped when the melody reached him. He gripped the railing. His face, aged to translucence, seemed to collapse inward for a moment. Then he began, very slowly, to cry. He said not to Charlotte, not to Xavier, not to anyone in particular, but to the room and the piano and the air, he said. She came home. Charlotte brought her father downstairs one step at a time and guided him to the settee near the piano. Samuel sat down heavily. He looked at Grace, who watched his descent with the wide, still attention of a child who senses something important is happening without knowing its shape. And he looked at her with the expression of someone who sees a person in a child, someone they had lost. Charlotte asked what he meant. She asked it gently, but she was asking. He asked to see the manuscript paper. Xavier brought it. Samuel held the page with both hands and studied the handwriting. After a long moment, he said, "This is her writing. Exactly her writing." He pressed his thumb against a marginal annotation in different ink, a fingering instruction added later. "She always annotated in blue," he said quietly. "Even as a girl," Charlotte said. As a girl? What Samuel told them in the next 20 minutes was not a prepared confession. It was the halting reconstruction of a man who had carried a private failure for decades and had just run out of reasons to keep it private. He had been 26 when he met Catherine Ward, a music teacher of modest means and considerable intelligence. When his mother found their letters, the machinery of the Kingsley household moved with the efficient cruelty of institutions protecting their interests. He had been 26 and not yet the man he would become, and he had failed to stand his ground. He had not known Catherine was pregnant when she left. He found out 2 years later, by which point he had entered the family arrangement his household preferred, and the information had arrived too late and too complicated. He tried. He hired intermediaries, used legal proxies, sent anonymous scholarship funds through a firm named Prescott. He wanted to support Hannah without exposing her to the Kingsley name's complications. Prescott eventually told him that Catherine had refused all communication. Samuel later discovered this was not entirely true. By then the firm had closed, the trail had scattered, and the years had compounded what began as delay into something that looked, from the outside, exactly like abandonment. Margaret, standing at the edge of the room, said she had done what was necessary to protect Charlotte and the family's stability. She said it with the conviction of someone who had lived inside that justification for so long. It had become indistinguishable from principle. Xavier had been listening quietly. When Samuel finished, he said, in a voice that was level and low, "She died, not knowing her father had tried to find her. She died, thinking she wasn't worth looking for." The words were not raised as an accusation. They were stated as fact. They were worse for it. Samuel asked when Hannah had died. Xavier said 3 years ago a cardiac complication she had had since childhood, caught too late. Samuel closed his eyes and lowered his head. Charlotte looked at Grace, who sat on the edge of the settee beside Samuel, patient and solemnly still. Charlotte thought about the instructions she had been about to give, asking Grace to leave so the adults could speak. She did not give it. She thought instead, with a clarity that surprised her, "This child is my niece." Charlotte asked everyone to come to the private study. She had Ryan inform the guests they were welcome in the East Wing reception and that the program would resume in 45 minutes. The study was a long room at the back of the house, bookshelves on one wall, glass cabinets of musical memorabilia on the other, framed photographs of performers, handwritten scores under glass, first edition music texts. On the mahogany desk stood a wooden box in dark walnut, with small brass fittings and a lock that required a key no larger than a thumbnail. Charlotte had seen this box her entire life. She had never seen it open. Samuel told her to check the center drawer. Under a folded invoice was the key on a plain ring. The lock released with a sound like a small clock finishing its count. Inside, 15 letters bound with cotton twine. A cassette tape labeled in block capitals, H Piano Compositions, 1998. 3 photographs of a teenage girl at a keyboard, and at the bottom, coiled in tissue paper, a player piano roll in a paper sleeve bearing Samuel's handwriting. "Hannah's piece keep for the day she returns." Charlotte unbound the letters and read the first. Hannah at conservatory, 2nd year, thanking the anonymous benefactor for the scholarship, studying composition, feeling, for the first time in her life, that she was in the right place. She wrote that she hoped one day to write something that made a stranger feel less alone. Charlotte read 4 more letters. Her hands had gone very still. The last letter was different, dated 7 years before Hannah's death, never mailed. Written directly to Samuel by name after Hannah traced the scholarship records through public arts funding databases and found a reference to the Kingsley Music Foundation as an affiliated grantor. She had hedged carefully. She thought he might be her father, that she could be wrong, that she was not looking for money or recognition or a place in any family that didn't want her. She wrote, "I only want to know if someone who shares my blood thought of me sometimes. That would be enough." Charlotte set the letter on the desk and did not speak. Xavier said from the doorway. She wrote that when Grace was about 1 year old, she spent 6 months tracing that scholarship. I didn't know she had found anything. Margaret appeared in the doorway. She said everyone should be mindful of the guests waiting, and that conversations of this nature benefited from legal guidance rather than being handled mid-event. She said she was trying to protect the family. Grace looked at the photograph of Hannah at 17 seated at a practice room keyboard, one hand raised mid-phrase, beginning to smile at whoever held the camera, and said, "Is that Mama when she was little?" The room went completely quiet. Samuel got down on one knee, slowly, with the painful deliberateness of old joints, until he was at Grace's level. He said he was very sorry. He said he had been too slow and had missed things he should not have missed, and he could not fix that, but he was sorry for it. Grace looked at him with the steady, serious attention she gave everything that mattered, and she did not look away. Charlotte asked Margaret very quietly to please go and see to the guests. Margaret understood what that meant. She left without another word. Charlotte excused herself for a few minutes. She walked to the small alcove near the library and stood at the window looking out at the garden in the rain. The lights made the wet grass luminous, and she stood there doing nothing in particular except being somewhere that no one needed her to perform anything. She thought about her father's face when the piano had played. She thought about the letter Hannah had never sent. She thought about a 6-year-old girl standing in this house in a green coat, being quietly told she was somewhere she did not belong. Charlotte had said that, with exactly the tone of every Kingsley before her that contained justification-free tone of someone who believes their standards are neutral. She had seen a man in old shoes and assumed he was out of place. She had seen a child and seen a problem. She had rehearsed a version of her family's history centered on what had been built and preserved, and had accepted without examination what the preservation had cost. A woman who spent her whole life not knowing her father had been searching for her. A child who had been asked to wait in the staff room. Charlotte walked back to the study. In the doorway, she saw Xavier sitting beside Grace on the small sofa, helping her draw a cartoon rabbit on the back of an event program. He had borrowed a pen from the desk without asking. Grace was directing where the hat should go. Charlotte said his name. He looked up. She made the apology. It came out slightly stiff at first, the apology of someone unaccustomed to the position. But she said what needed to be said. She had been wrong to judge him by his appearance, wrong to have him escorted out, and wrong to let the audience see it without correction. Xavier considered it for a moment. He said he had grown accustomed to being underestimated, and he had learned to let it pass. But Grace did not deserve to learn the same lesson. He didn't need her sympathy. He needed whatever was true about Hannah to be treated as true. Charlotte said, "You're right. I'll say so, in front of everyone who was there." Samuel, from across the room, said quietly, "No more hiding. We've protected the family's image long enough. What we have actually protected is the hiding itself. It doesn't serve anyone." Charlotte stood for a moment, then said, "Then we start tonight." She walked back into the main hall. She asked the string quartet to stop. They stopped. She stood near the Bosendorfer and faced the room without notes or prepared remarks. She was still in the navy gown, her composure still visible from a distance. But she did not look like the woman who had moved through this hall 2 hours earlier with the controlled urgency of a manager. She looked like someone who had walked through something and come out the other side with different information. She said, "I want to tell you something true about this evening before we continue." She told the room that a man had arrived tonight to service this piano, and that she had treated him as though he didn't belong here. She said she had asked him to leave in front of witnesses, and that this was a mistake she was not going to let stand uncorrected. She said his name was Xavier Cole. She said he was a piano technician who had done more for this family tonight than he could have imagined when he accepted the appointment. She said the melody that had played earlier was a composition by his late wife, Hannah Cole, a gifted composer and a scholarship recipient of the Kingsley Music Foundation, who had a connection to this family that should have been acknowledged long ago and had not been. She said she took responsibility for the culture of silence that had made that possible. She said, "We are going to correct that tonight." The man in the charcoal suit who had made the remark about security looked at the floor. Xavier came into the hall from the corridor doorway with Grace beside him. He walked to the piano and stood there, not at the center of the room but beside the instrument. He did not need the center. He had Grace's hand. Samuel, wheeled in by his nurse, spoke briefly from near the window. He said the piece they had heard was called "When the Rain Comes Home," and had been written by Hannah Cole, a musician connected to this family, in ways the family had failed to make public. The failure was his own. Hannah was no longer alive to be introduced to them, but her music was in this room, and her daughter was standing beside the piano, and he hoped the foundation would honor her properly going forward. Charlotte announced that the foundation's annual scholarship would be renamed the Hannah Cole Music Scholarship, funded permanently, awarded to young artists of demonstrated talent whose families lacked the financial means or institutional connections to support their ambitions. The older woman near the fireplace who had attended every one of the 22 galas stood up. The room followed. Charlotte looked at Xavier. He looked back. Neither of them had the vocabulary yet for what this was going to become, but both understood it was something. Charlotte asked whether Xavier would be willing to play the piece for the room just once, if he was willing. Xavier said no. He said he hadn't played in a long time. Grace looked up at him and said, "Mama would like it if you played, Daddy." The hall was quiet enough that everyone heard it. Xavier sat down at the Bosendorfer. He placed his hands on the keys. His hands were the hands of a technician calloused along the inner finger pads, a faint old scar across the right knuckle from a workshop accident years before, and they rested on a concert grand that was worth more than his car and his tools combined. He did not think about the disparity. He was already inside the music. He played "When the Rain Comes Home" from memory slowly, imperfectly, with slight hesitations in the passages where his fingers found their way back to notes he hadn't touched in 3 years. But the melody was fully present, and the room was fully present with it. Halfway through the second movement, Grace began to sing very softly the words Hannah had made up for the melody. Words she had sung at bedtime so many times they had become part of Grace's body alongside her bones and her breath. Samuel wept without covering his face. Charlotte stood with her hands clasped and let the tears fall without trying to stop them, something she had not permitted herself in public since she was 13 years old. When the piece ended, no one moved for several seconds. Then the room exhaled and began to applaud, quiet, continuous, the kind that does not require volume to be real. Xavier lifted his hands from the keys. He looked at Grace. He said, just to her. She heard it. The guests left after 11. Most spoke to Charlotte before going, reaching for words that were genuine but slightly short of adequate, the language people find when they have witnessed something they didn't come prepared for. The major donors told her the scholarship renaming was the right call. Charlotte thanked them and meant it, and also knew that their approval was not why she had done it. Margaret had come back to the study while Charlotte was still in the hall and produced a prepared summary. Reasons why the family should consult legal counsel before any public acknowledgement of Hannah's connection to Samuel, with particular reference to estate complications. She suggested Xavier's presence could be construed as opportunistic, and that Grace's potential position as a grandchild unverified could open proceedings the estate was not positioned to manage. Xavier was in the hallway. He heard most of it. He stepped into the doorway and said, "If I had come here for money, I would have arrived with a lawyer instead of a toolkit. I've carried a letter with the Kingsley name on it for 3 years, and made no calls, not to an attorney, not to a reporter, not to anyone. My wife asked me to treat this carefully, and I have been treating it carefully. The only thing I want is for Grace to grow up knowing her mother was not a person that history forgot. That is the entire scope of it. Margaret said she was protecting the family. Charlotte said, "You're protecting a version of the family that we've already agreed to let go." Samuel said he had revised his estate documents 18 months ago. He had established a private educational trust for any living heir of Hannah Ward Cole, should one be identified and verified. He had done this without informing the household staff, because he had anticipated this conversation. He had not expected to be alive when it happened. He was glad he was. Margaret looked at Samuel for a long moment. She took her cardigan from the back of the chair, said she would submit her resignation in the morning, and walked out. The front door opened and closed. That was the end of 19 years. Charlotte sat on the arm of the settee and pressed both hands over her face, an entirely uncomposed gesture that somehow made her seem more real than anything she had done all evening. She looked at Xavier and asked if she could ask him something. He said yes. She asked whether she could be part of Grace's life going forward. Not as a legal matter, just as a person connected to Grace's mother who wanted to know the child connected to that music. Xavier was quiet for a moment. He looked at Grace, asleep on the sofa with the rabbit tucked under her chin. He said, "I can't make promises tonight about what trust looks like. That takes time. But if you want to know who Hannah was, there are recordings, there are notebooks, there are things I can show you that would help you understand what you missed and what is still here. That is where it can start." Charlotte said that was fair. Samuel reached into the side drawer and withdrew a small velvet bundle. He looked at Xavier for permission. Xavier nodded. Xavier woke Grace gently. She sat up, blinking. Samuel placed the bundle in her hands. Inside was a music box, dark green lacquer, a small key at the base. He said the family had kept it for years, and it had been waiting for the right person to wind it. Grace turned the key 3 times and opened the lid. The music box played a short phrase, not Hannah's melody exactly, but something intimate in the same quiet way. Grace listened, with her eyes closed. She asked, "Did my mama ever hear this?" Samuel said, "No, she didn't, but she should have." 3 weeks after the gala, on a Saturday in late November, Xavier brought Grace back to the Kingsley estate. Charlotte had called and asked if they would like to come, and Xavier had thought about it for 2 days before saying yes. He arrived in his own car, without his toolkit, wearing a clean shirt. Charlotte met them at the front door. Not the service entrance, the front door. The estate was different in daylight and quiet. The chandeliers were off, the rooms lit by afternoon sun coming through the tall windows in broad, warm columns across the floors. The Bosendorfer sat where it always had, lid open, fallboard raised. On the music stand, Charlotte had placed a framed photograph of Hannah, the girl at the keyboard from the box in the study. Hand raised mid-phrase, beginning to smile at whoever held the camera. It was the first photograph of Hannah that had ever occupied any surface in this house. Charlotte had spent 3 weeks reading. Every letter in the box. The cassette tape twice all the way through Hannah at 19. Playing compositions at a conservatory practice piano, the recording quality thin but the music entirely clear. She had done what she kept telling herself she was doing, without fully acknowledging it yet. She had grieved. Not for someone she had known, but for the gap itself, for the parallel line of a life that had run alongside her family's history without touching it, kept apart by a series of choices that had seemed, to the people making them, like pragmatism. She had also formalized the Hannah Cole Music Scholarship through the Foundation's legal office. The first application cycle would open in January. The criteria: demonstrated musical talent, financial need, and a family situation in which conventional pathways to arts education were unlikely without support. Charlotte had written the criteria herself. She had thought of Grace while writing every word. Samuel was seated in the music room when they arrived, wrapped in a cardigan with a cup of tea he had not drunk. When Grace came in, he held out one hand, and Grace went to him without hesitation, the way children go to people they have decided to trust. She showed him the rabbit. He asked its name. She said Clover. He said that was an excellent name. Xavier stood in the doorway of the music room. The room was smaller than the main hall, more personal. a reading chair in the corner, framed sheet music on the walls, the piano at the window with afternoon light spread across its keys. It did not feel like an estate room. It felt like a room where someone had actually lived. Charlotte came to stand beside him. After a moment, she said she had listened to the tape of Hannah playing and had been struck by how unhurried it was. Hannah played like someone who believed she had time, which was not true, and that made it both beautiful and unbearable. Xavier said Hannah had always played that way. She never performed for an audience in her own mind. She played as though the music needed to be understood before it needed to be heard. Charlotte said she wished she had known her. Xavier said, "You can still know her. That's what the music is for." Grace sat down at the piano. She looked at her father for permission. He said yes. Go ahead. She placed her hands on the keys with the careful deliberateness of a child who has been told that a piano is a serious thing and has decided she agrees. She found the opening notes of When the Rain Comes Home with her right hand. Slowly, the way you find footing on unfamiliar ground. Charlotte sat in the chair beside the piano. Not formally, not as a hostess. She sat beside Grace, the way a person sits when they are learning what a new relationship might actually mean. Tentative, genuine, paying close attention. Samuel listened with his eyes closed. Xavier stood in the room and listened to his daughter play his wife's song on the piano his wife had never touched, in the house that had never known her name until 3 weeks ago. The rain had returned, lighter than on the night of the gala, barely a mist against the windows, catching the afternoon light and making it diffuse and soft. Outside the music room door, on a small brass plaque Charlotte had mounted that morning, were 2 lines, "The Hannah Cole Room," for every song that was almost forgotten. Xavier had read those words when they arrived. He had stopped in the corridor for a moment, in front of that plaque, and stood there in silence. Some things are not meant to be spoken. They are meant to be stood in front of, quietly, for as long as it takes. On the night Xavier had been asked to leave the Kingsley estate, he had believed he was walking away with nothing but his daughter and his dignity. He had been right about the dignity. He had been wrong about the nothing. He had walked out carrying the music, and the music had known the way back.